Alcohol. Alcohol doesn't hit one system. It hits several simultaneously. It boosts GABA, the brain's main inhibitory signal, which is why everything slows down and the anxiety quiets. It suppresses glutamate, the excitatory counterpart, which deepens the sedation. And it triggers a dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward center, that reads as genuine pleasure. The problem is the brain adapts. After enough exposure, it downregulates GABA receptors and upregulates glutamate receptors to compensate. Now the baseline without alcohol is anxious, jittery, and wired. The drink doesn't produce pleasure anymore. It produces normal. That shift from drinking to feel good to drinking to feel nothing is where alcohol dependency begins. Withdrawal from severe alcohol dependence can cause seizures and death, which is not true of most other substances on this list. Nicotine. Nicotine reaches the brain in roughly 10 seconds after inhalation. It binds to acetylcholine receptors and triggers a dopamine release that's fast, predictable, and mild enough that the user can maintain it across an entire day without impairment. That combination, fast, reliable, low disruption, is what makes nicotine one of the most addictive substances ever documented. The brain quickly builds tolerance and multiplies its acetylcholine receptors to compensate for the constant stimulation. More receptors means more craving when the nicotine disappears. The withdrawal isn't medically dangerous, but the craving is relentless precisely because the receptor upregulation makes the absence of nicotine feel worse than its presence ever felt good. Cocaine. Cocaine blocks the reuptake of dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine simultaneously. Dopamine floods the synapse and stays there instead of being cleared away. The result is an intensity of reward signal that nothing in the natural environment can match. The brain wasn't built to receive a signal that strong. After repeated use, the brain compensates by reducing its dopamine receptor density. Fewer receptors mean ordinary pleasures register as flat. Food, sex, social interaction, all of it feels muted. The user isn't chasing a high at that point. They're chasing baseline function. Methamphetamine runs on the same mechanism but goes further, actively triggering dopamine release in addition to blocking reuptake, which is why the crash is harder and the receptor damage more persistent. Opioids. Opioids bind to mu-opioid receptors throughout the brain and body. Those receptors exist because the brain produces its own opioids naturally. Endorphins and enkephalins, for pain suppression and reward. Heroin and synthetic opioids like fentanyl bind to those same receptors with a strength and speed the brain's own chemicals can't match. The reward signal is enormous. So is the adaptation. The brain downregulates its own opioid receptor density and reduces its own endorphin production. Without the drug, the user doesn't just feel no pleasure. They feel active physical pain, anxiety, and an unbearable restlessness the brain interprets as a survival emergency. That's withdrawal. It's not a moral failure. It's a nervous system that reorganized itself around an external input and is now receiving none of it. Gambling. Gambling addiction doesn't require a chemical at all. It runs on the brain's own dopamine system through a mechanism called variable ratio reinforcement. Unpredictable rewards trigger a larger dopamine response than predictable ones. A slot machine that pays out randomly trains the brain more powerfully than one that pays out on a fixed schedule. For the same reason, hunting was more neurologically engaging than farming. The near miss is particularly effective. A slot that shows two matching symbols and one wrong fires a dopamine response almost as large as an actual win. The brain treats almost as evidence of progress, not failure. Over time, the gambling itself, the anticipation, the action, the near miss, the brief window before the outcome resolves, produces more dopamine than the payout does. The money becomes incidental. The loop is the product. Casino designers have known this for decades. The architecture of every major gambling floor on Earth is built around extending that window as long as possible. Social media. Social media runs the same variable ratio reinforcement mechanism as a slot machine. Engineered deliberately. The scroll produces unpredictable rewards, a funny video, a notification, a like, on a schedule nobody can predict. The brain responds with a small dopamine pulse each time. The pull to refresh gesture is structurally identical to pulling a slot machine lever, which is not a coincidence. The difference between screen use and chemical addiction is degree, not mechanism. The dopamine spikes are smaller. The receptor downregulation is slower. The withdrawal is social discomfort rather than physical illness. But the underlying loop, behavior, produces unpredictable reward. Reward trains repetition, baseline pleasure flattens, use increases to maintain normal. It's the same loop running at a lower intensity across a much larger population. Why willpower doesn't work? Here's the part where the standard advice falls apart. The standard advice is to want it less. Use willpower. Make better choices. That advice misunderstands the biology. By the time addiction is established, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term planning and impulse control, has been functionally subordinated to the limbic system, which is running a survival-level acquisition loop on the substance or behavior. Telling someone in active addiction to use willpower is like telling someone with a broken leg to walk it off. The mechanism you're asking them to use is the one that's been most disrupted. This is why the most effective treatment approaches: medication-assisted treatment for opioids, nicotine replacement therapy, behavioral interventions for gambling, work by addressing the biological disruption directly rather than asking the disrupted system to fix itself through effort. The recovery mechanism. The brain is plastic. The receptor changes that addiction produces are not permanent. Abstinence allows receptor density to recover, but the timeline is slow. Months to years depending on the substance. And the vulnerability doesn't fully disappear. Stress, environmental cues, and specific emotional states can reactivate craving responses in people with years of sobriety. Because the neural pathways built during active use don't get erased. They get quieter. This is why relapse rates for addiction look similar to relapse rates for other chronic conditions like hypertension and diabetes. It's not a character flaw unique to addicted people. It's a chronic condition that requires ongoing management rather than a one-time fix. The people who recover most durably tend to change their environment, their social context, and their relationship to stress simultaneously. Not because willpower kicked in, but because the cues that triggered the loop stopped being present. The pattern. Strip the labels off every addiction on this list and the underlying mechanism is identical. A stimulus produces a dopamine signal stronger or more reliable than anything in the natural environment. The brain adapts to that signal by reducing its own baseline sensitivity. The absence of the stimulus now feels worse than the presence felt good. Use continues to restore normal rather than to produce pleasure. The behavior is no longer a choice in any meaningful sense of the word. The thing that separates the substances and behaviors on this list from each other is speed of onset, intensity of reward, and severity of the adaptation. Fentanyl runs the loop faster and harder than alcohol. Alcohol runs it faster and harder than social media. The loop is the same. The dial is just set differently. Conclusion. Understanding how addiction works doesn't make it easier to stop. What it does is replace a moral framework. This person is weak, this person chose this, with an accurate one. This person's brain reorganized itself around an input and now needs the right conditions to reorganize back. That shift matters because the moral framework produces shame. And shame is one of the most consistent relapse triggers in the addiction literature. People don't recover faster because they feel worse about themselves. They recover faster when the shame drops and the actual mechanism gets addressed. The brain that got addicted is the same brain that can recover. It just needs the right conditions, the right time, and usually the right support to do it. The hardware isn't broken. The software got rewritten. Rewrites take time.